The crisp April sunlight spilled across the weathered oak breakfast table in our quiet Spokane home, casting long, golden ribbons against the pristine white walls. I had just brought my 78-year-old grandfather, Arthur Vance, home from Spokane General Hospital, where the sterile smell of medical antiseptic still seemed to linger faintly on his soft cotton sweater. Sitting across from me with a steaming mug of black coffee held firmly between his calloused hands, he looked frail, yet remarkably composed after his grueling medical ordeal. As I set down a plate of warm toast, his tired blue eyes locked onto mine with a sudden, startling clarity that commanded my complete and undivided attention. Slowly, without a trace of hesitation or trembling in his voice, he leaned across the wooden table and whispered a question that hung suspended in the air. "Would you like to test them with me?" I understood immediately who them referred to. My father Richard, my mother Eleanor, and my younger brother Brandon, who had not checked on him once during his entire week in intensive care. Without saying a single word, I reached into my pocket, pulled out my smartphone, tapped my father's number, and placed the device squarely in the middle of the table, on speakerphone. The digital dial tone echoed twice through the silent kitchen, sounding like a slow, heavy heartbeat, before the line picked up with an offhanded, distracted greeting from my father. I kept my voice entirely flat, stripped of all emotion, as I delivered the rehearsed sentence directly into the glowing microphone today. "Dad, Grandpa passed away last night," I said softly into the speakerphone, holding my breath as the heavy silence stretched across the line. There was no gasp of genuine shock, no sorrowful pause, nor a single hesitation. Instead, my father uttered a cold, hollow sigh that echoed grimly through our quiet kitchen. "So, the old man finally died," Richard muttered, his tone dripping with sheer indifference, before another cruel voice greedily cut in from the background. My younger brother Brandon, sitting in the same room, immediately shouted, "Grandpa left everything to me, so don't you dare touch a single thing!" Right after his shameless declaration, my mother Eleanor let out a short, smug laugh, the exact sound of someone who believed she had just won a lottery. They thought they were completely safe, utterly convinced that their calculated patience had finally paid off, while Arthur sat less than 3 feet away, hearing every cruel word. Leaning forward toward the glowing screen, my grandfather opened his mouth and spoke with a terrifying, icy composure. "I am thrilled my departure brings you such immense relief." An instantaneous, sharp gasp pierced the speaker, followed by the violent scrape of a chair and the sharp shatter of a glass spilling onto a hardwood floor. "Dad?" Richard stammered, his arrogant confidence evaporating into panicked disbelief as he frantically attempted to piece together a pathetic excuse about a dark joke. "There is nothing left to explain," Arthur stated firmly, extending a steady hand to press the red disconnect icon, plunging the room into absolute, decisive silence today. A week earlier, the suffocating scent of antiseptic in room 402 of Spokane General Hospital was heavy, but my grandfather's profound isolation felt infinitely heavier. I spent 7 grueling days sitting in a stiff plastic chair beside his bed, holding his weathered hand, while monitors beeped rhythmically against his severe medical infection. When doctors warned his condition was critical, I immediately called my parents, expecting them to rush through the emergency room doors with deep personal concern. Instead, Richard claimed pressing business negotiations prevented him from visiting. Eleanor insisted hospitals triggered unbearable anxiety. And Brandon left my frantic text messages completely unread. Every time the heavy wooden door creaked open, Arthur shifted his tired gaze toward the entrance, desperately hoping his son would walk through to offer comfort. Yet it was always just a nurse checking vitals, leaving him to stare silently at the ceiling as the painful truth of their abandonment shattered his spirit. Years ago, after my grandmother passed away, traditional expectations regarding male heirs had led Arthur to draft an old will favoring Richard and Brandon. They had grown up assuming his fortune was their guaranteed birthright, treating his lifelong generosity as an obligation rather than a gift cultivated through hard labor. Sitting beside his bed through those dark nights, wiping his feverish brow without asking for anything, I showed him what unconditional love truly looked like. That heartbreaking week taught Arthur a vital lesson. Genuine family is never defined by shared DNA or entitlement, but by who faithfully holds your hand in the dark today. As the silence settled after the disconnected call, the raw heartbreak in my grandfather's eyes gradually transformed into a quiet, unshakable steel resolve. There were no dramatic outbursts of helpless rage or tears of self-pity. Instead, decades of stoic resilience took firm root within his soul as he pushed his heavy wooden chair back. He stood up slowly, aligning his posture with an enduring dignity that commanded deep respect, and looked at me with an expression of absolute, unwavering determination. "Call the security company immediately," Arthur instructed, his voice steady and completely devoid of hesitation. "I want every digital alarm code changed before noon today." He directed me to contact a local locksmith to replace all heavy deadbolts on the front and back doors before the afternoon sun began to dip below the horizon. If Richard, Eleanor, or Brandon show up at this gate, they are not to set foot inside my home under any circumstances, he added firmly, drawing a definitive line. We both knew my father now understood Arthur was alive, and more importantly, realized we had overheard their callous celebration of his fabricated passing. Panicked self-preservation would soon drive Richard to act, but Arthur was no longer the unsuspecting father willing to turn a blind eye to disrespect. By fortifying our physical perimeter, my grandfather declared his home a sacred sanctuary, signaling that the toxic reign of ungrateful relatives had officially come to an end. He turned toward the hallway with quiet purpose, stepping forward into a new chapter defined by self-respect, boundaries, and absolute clarity today. Later that afternoon, after the locksmith installed reinforced deadbolts and the security technician updated our alarm codes, Arthur and I sat together on the back porch. A gentle spring breeze rustled pine needles, carrying the crisp scent of mountain air across the yard as we cradled warm mugs between our hands. The heavy cloud of emotional betrayal that had hovered over our breakfast table had begun to lift, replaced by an empowering atmosphere of quiet clarity and shared purpose. Looking out over the lawn he had maintained for 40 years, my grandfather turned to me with a serene expression that revealed the depth of his inner healing. Getting older might slow my physical steps, Chloe, but it will never give anyone the right to strip away my dignity or steal my autonomy, he said. He emphasized that true self-worth is not something we surrender to greedy relatives out of misplaced obligation or fear of standing alone in life's autumn seasons. By establishing firm emotional boundaries and refusing to tolerate disrespect, he was taking back complete control over his destiny, legacy, and peace of mind. I placed my hand over his, feeling the steady strength in his calloused fingers, profoundly inspired by his courage to reclaim self-respect against those who sought exploitation. We sat together in peaceful silence as golden evening light bathed the porch, knowing that whatever personal battles lay ahead, our bond remained unshakable. In that quiet moment, Arthur proved that standing up for dignity is a timeless choice, paving the way for a future rooted in honor today. Morning arrived, not with a sudden burst of glory, but with the quiet, persistent grace of dust motes settling in a sunbeam. In this second chapter of his journey, the noise that had once plagued his mind finally began to recede, leaving behind an unfamiliar, spacious silence that felt less like emptiness and more like an invitation. He walked down the narrow gravel path toward the edge of the woods, where the oak trees stood like ancient guardians, indifferent to the turbulence of human grief. The morning air carried the sharp, sweet scent of pine and damp earth, grounding him in the physical reality of the present moment. For months, he had treated his pain like a thief in the house, constantly watching the doors, afraid of what might be stolen next. But standing there, bathed in the amber warmth of the rising sun, he began to realize that the heart does not heal by fortifying its walls. It heals by letting the light reach the unpaved places inside. The frost on the grass was melting, turning into drops of liquid diamond that caught the first rays of dawn, proving that even the coldest nights must eventually yield to warmth. He took a long, deliberate breath, feeling his lungs expand with cool air, and realized that survival was no longer enough. He wanted to live. The horizon opened up before him, wide and unburdened, asking for nothing more than his presence, his patience, and his willingness to take one small step forward at a time, trusting the gentle earth beneath his feet. He sat upon a weathered wooden bench near the old riverbank, where the moving water hummed a steady, ancient lullaby. From his pocket, he pulled out a small, dog-eared notebook containing the remnants of his past choices, the lingering ghosts of regret that had kept him awake through countless dark nights. For years, he had believed that to move forward, one had to erase what came before, to burn the map that led to heartbreak. Yet, as he traced the faded blue ink on the yellowed pages, a wave of profound compassion washed over him. For the person he used to be. That younger self had not failed out of malice, but out of fear, swimming upstream in a current far too strong for a tired heart. Grief, he understood now, was not an enemy to be conquered, nor was it a defect in the human spirit. It was simply love that had lost its original destination, wandering until it found a place to rest. He did not tear the pages out, nor did he hide them away in shame. Instead, he closed the notebook with gentle reverence, honoring every scar as proof of endurance rather than evidence of defeat. The river kept flowing, carrying fallen leaves away without effort or strain, demonstrating the quiet art of letting go. In that moment of gentle surrender, he felt the heavy iron weight in his chest begin to dissolve, making space for a deeper, softer kind of enduring strength to take root within the quiet sanctuary of his very own healing spirit. Later that afternoon, a chance encounter transformed his quiet solitude into an uncalculated connection that shifted the entire trajectory of his day. An elderly woodworker whose hands were calloused and weathered like the bark of an old cedar tree was sitting on a porch nearby, shaping a block of pine with slow, deliberate movements. As he paused to watch, the old man looked up and smiled, offering not a word of advice or unsolicited wisdom, but simply a cup of warm tea and a quiet place to sit. The steam from the earthen mug rose slowly, carrying the comforting scent of roasted leaves between them. They shared a long silence that felt surprisingly comfortable, broken only by the rhythmic scraping of the blade against wood and the distant calls of chickadees in the canopy above. In the simple act of being seen without needing to explain himself, he realized how profoundly isolated he had felt in his suffering. The old craftsman showed him a wooden bowl he was restoring, pointing to a fissure filled with gold dust, explaining that in ancient tradition, breaking a vessel only enhances its story and value. That quiet lesson hung softly in the afternoon air, striking a chord deep within his soul, echoing the fundamental truth that grace does not require absolute perfection. Human beings, like wooden bowls or weathered stones, are not ruined by the cracks they carry. Rather, those very open fissures are where the luminous light finds its quiet way inside, illuminating the beauty that was always present beneath the weathered surface. As dusk began to settle over the hills, painting the horizon in shades of lavender, indigo, and soft rose, a quiet transformation took root within his heart. The relentless urge to control every outcome, to fix every past mistake, finally dissolved into the stillness of the twilight hour. He leaned back comfortably against the rough bark of an old, towering pine tree, watching the evening star appear like a lone lantern in the deepening sky, shining with quiet confidence. For the first time in years, he surrendered his endless internal arguments, choosing peace over the exhausting need to prove himself right or blame himself for what was lost. Forgiveness, he realized in that sacred pause, was not an act of condoning past errors, nor was it a magic eraser that removed history. It was simply the courageous decision to unburden his hands so he could receive the gifts of the present. The cool evening breeze whispered through the branches, carrying away the lingering smoke of past resentments, leaving behind an unexpected lightness in his chest. He felt integrated, no longer split into conflicting fragments of who he used to be and who he ought to become. The darkness of night was not a threat to be feared, but a soft blanket under which rest could finally occur, preparing the soul for another day. He gently closed his eyes and felt a deep, resonant wave of genuine gratitude for the simple gift of being alive, standing whole, peaceful, and grounded in the quiet majesty of the boundless, unfolding, open, natural universe. When the next morning broke, the light felt distinctly different, sharper, warmer, deeper, and filled with infinite promise. He stood at the edge of the valley, looking out over the winding road that stretched into the distance, no longer seeing it as an intimidating journey into the unknown, but as a grand canvas waiting for his footsteps. Healing had not erased his history or turned him into someone unrecognizable. Rather, it had restored his capacity to feel, to love, and to engage fully with the world around him. The scars he bore were no longer burdens to carry, but badges of courage, living testaments to his resilience and capacity for growth. He knew that difficult days would still come, that storm clouds would occasionally gather on the horizon, but he also knew that he possessed an unshakable anchor within himself. With a light step and an open heart, he began to walk down the path, eager to share the quiet grace he had discovered with anyone who might be walking in darkness. His story was no longer a tragedy of what was lost, but a quiet anthem of renewal, a gentle reminder that every ending carries the seed of a hopeful beginning. He smiled broadly as the morning sun kissed his face, stepping forward into the morning light with courage, purpose, and a heart ready to embrace whatever comes next. Every step felt like a prayer of gratitude, an invitation to keep moving forward, fully alive, completely whole, and deeply restored in the boundless, warm love of his own life itself. The morning came, not with a thunderous epiphany, but with the quiet, persistent blue of early light slipping through the linen curtains, illuminating the dust motes suspended in the air like microscopic galaxies. For 24 long seasons, he had carried the unspoken weight of a life deferred, treating his heart like a fragile glass heirloom that might shatter under the slightest pressure of truth. Yet, standing by the window with a lukewarm mug of black coffee, watching the frost dissolve into glistening droplets upon the glass, he felt the first gentle thawing of an inner winter that had lasted far too long. Grief, he realized, was not an anchor designed to drown a soul in perpetual darkness, but a rough tide that eventually washes us ashore, stripped of our illusions and ready to be rebuilt. The past was no longer a house of shadows he was forced to haunt, but a foundation laid in stone, imperfect, weather-worn, yet sturdy enough to support whatever he chose to construct next. He inhaled deeply, letting the sharp, pine-scented chill of the northern autumn fill his lungs, feeling the rhythmic, undeniable cadence of his own breathing. There was an incredible, sacred beauty in the realization that survival was not merely an accident of endurance, but a conscious choice made every single morning. He smoothed his worn denim jacket, stepped across the creaking floorboards, and unlocked the back door, allowing the crisp air to sweep away the stale ghosts of yesterday, ready at last to meet his own life on its own unvarnished terms. Walking out into the overgrown orchard behind the cottage, he felt the damp soil yielding beneath the soles of his boots, a tactile reminder of the grounding reality that had always existed just beyond the margins of his grief. The old apple trees, gnarled and twisted by decades of brutal prairie winters, still bore fruit on their highest branches, small, sweet, and stubborn against the encroaching cold. He reached up to pick a golden pear apple, feeling its rough, sunburned skin against his palm, before taking a slow, thoughtful bite. The sharp sweetness burst across his palate, reminding him of simple, uncomplicated pleasures that he had denied himself in his self-imposed exile of regret. Healing, he began to understand as he walked among the mossy trunks, was not an instantaneous miracle that descended from the heavens. It was a slow, quiet labor, akin to tending a neglected garden. It required turning over the compacted earth of broken promises, pulling up the weeds of bitterness by their deep roots, and trusting that the earth beneath still contained enough nourishment to foster new growth. He knelt by the wooden bench his grandfather had built half a century ago, running his thumb along the smooth, weathered grain of the wood where rain and sun had softened the sharp edges. Nature did not hurry its restoration, nor did it apologize for the scars left by lightning or drought. It simply continued the quiet work of blooming where it was rooted, offering its quiet, unpretentious beauty to anyone patient enough to witness its slow triumph. By midday, the high sun illuminated the dusty country road leading into town, a path he had spent months avoiding out of fear of confronting the faces of those who knew his history. Yet, as he walked down the gravel drive, he realized that true grace does not demand that we erase our past failures, but rather that we reframe them with profound compassion. The wounds we carry are not stains that diminish our worth. They are the honorable maps of where we have been, the physical evidence that we fought, suffered, and somehow survived the darkest tempests of existence. Forgiving oneself, he recognized, was perhaps the most courageous act a human heart could ever perform, requiring us to release the impossible expectation of a perfect past so we might inhabit the present with honesty. He thought of the letter sitting on his desk indoors, the unaddressed confession he had rewritten 24 times over the years, trying to explain the unexplainable. Today, he felt no urge to mail it or burn it. Instead, he was content to let it exist as an artifact of a younger, frightened version of himself who did not yet know how to hold pain without letting it define him. We are all flawed vessels, cracked in subtle and visible ways, yet it is precisely through those fractures that the light of genuine empathy pours into the world, allowing us to connect deeply with the shared heartbeats and silent struggles of everyone around us, reminding us that brokenness is never the end of our story. When he finally reached the porch of the old general store in town, the familiar brass bell chimed above the door, announcing his arrival with a sound that felt both strange and deeply nostalgic. Mrs. Gable looked up from behind the wooden counter, her eyes widening slightly, before softening into a warm, knowing smile that carried no judgment, only the quiet, unassuming hospitality of small-town folk. "Good to see you out, son," she said simply, handing him a brown paper bag of fresh coffee beans, without asking for explanations or forcing empty pleasantries. In that brief, unvarnished exchange, he felt the heavy mantle of isolation slip from his shoulders, replaced by the profound comfort of belonging to a community that held space for healing. Human connection, he understood then, did not require grand declarations or dramatic reconciliations. Often, it was built upon these small, ordinary bridges of kindness extended across the quiet gulfs of separation. He lingered on the porch for a long moment, watching the local children race their bicycles down the leaf-strewn sidewalk, their uninhibited laughter ringing through the afternoon air like silver chimes. The world had kept turning while he was hiding away, continuing its vibrant, messy, beautiful dance. And for the first time in 24 months, he felt a desperate, joyful longing to participate in it once again. He took a seat on the wooden step, inhaled the rich aroma of roasted coffee, and greeted a passing neighbor by name. Feeling the long-standing ice around his voice melt into genuine, easy, abiding warmth. As twilight painted the evening sky in brushed strokes of amber, violet, and deep indigo, he walked back up the hill toward his small cottage, feeling lighter with every step. The path was the same one he had walked 1,000 times, yet everything appeared subtly transformed, bathed in the soft, forgiving light of a heart that had chosen to open itself to hope once again. Standing on the ridge overlooking the valley below, where tiny golden lights were beginning to flicker on in distant farmhouses like earthbound stars, he realized that the 24 chapters of pain and longing had not been a wasted detour, but the precise crucible required to forge his true resilience. Hope was not a foolish fantasy reserved for those who had never known heartbreak. It was the quiet, radical defiance of choosing to believe in tomorrow despite everything one had suffered yesterday. He leaned against the porch railing, watching the night fold softly over the landscape, no longer afraid of the shadows or the silence that accompanied them. Inside his chest, a quiet flame was burning, not the frantic blaze of youth, but a steady, enduring light that promised warmth through whatever seasons lay ahead. He stepped back into the cottage, left the door unlocked, and picked up his pen, ready to write the 25th chapter with a steady hand, an open spirit, and a deep, unshakable gratitude for the breathtaking, miraculous gift of being fully alive in an ever-renewing world, knowing that every ending is merely a quiet dawn waiting to be embraced. Evelyn Reed's forensic financial audit closed in on the $375,000 stolen from Arthur's primary savings account. Intense panic rippled through my parents' desperate camp. Realizing that bank fraud alerts and criminal law enforcement investigations were imminent, Eleanor and Richard scrambled desperately to fabricate a legal shield that could halt our momentum. To preemptively block the court from freezing their personal bank accounts and to evade felony grand larceny charges, their ambitious attorney hastily submitted a supplementary document to the county courthouse. They labeled this newly manufactured paper an official loan and gift addendum, brazenly claiming that Arthur had voluntarily authorized the massive wire transfer as an unconditional financial gift to Brandon. My mother had orchestrated this calculated maneuver in a frenzied attempt to convince the presiding judge that the entire sum was a legitimate, pre-planned family inheritance distribution. They foolishly believed this single piece of paper would force the court to dismiss all allegations of financial exploitation and permanently validate their possession of the stolen funds. When Maxwell Sterling received the digital copy through his secure legal portal on Wednesday afternoon, he immediately printed the physical file and called us into his inner office. Sitting across from his heavy mahogany desk, my grandfather adjusted his wire-rimmed reading glasses, his quiet expression darkening as he stared intently at the newly submitted addendum. The villains thought they had constructed an impenetrable legal fortress to protect their ill-gotten wealth, but their hasty, reckless act of desperation had actually opened the door to their complete downfall today. Examining the printed document under the bright desk lamp, Maxwell pointed his pen directly at the signature block at the bottom of the final page. There, written in bold black ink, was Arthur's distinct signature, appearing entirely authentic at first glance to an untrained, casual observer. My grandfather ran his calloused index finger slowly over the smooth lines, a sharp, dangerous edge hardening his voice as he looked up at Maxwell. "That is undeniably my signature," Arthur stated firmly. "But I never signed this specific piece of paper, nor have I ever seen these words in my entire life." The truth behind Eleanor's scheme quickly became glaringly obvious. She had rummaged through old family files stored in her dark basement to locate a legitimate, outdated contract Arthur had executed years ago. Using that authentic document as a physical template, my mother placed a blank sheet over his original signature and utilized a light board to meticulously trace every single loop and curve. She drafted the fabricated gift text around the traced signature and backdated the addendum to match the exact date of the $375,000 wire transfer. Eleanor genuinely believed that her mechanical forgery would act as an unshakable legal shield, effectively insulating her family from severe criminal liability and civil lawsuits. She assumed no one would dare question a signature that matched Arthur's handwriting so closely, completely ignorant of the advanced forensic science designed to expose such deception. Her arrogant attempt to outsmart the justice system had laid the groundwork for an irrefutable criminal trap today. Recognizing the immediate legal necessity of definitive scientific proof, Maxwell carefully placed the physical addendum document into a sealed, tamper-evident plastic evidence sleeve. He picked up his desk phone and immediately contacted a premier forensic document laboratory based in Seattle, arranging for emergency high-tech analysis. By Thursday morning, a bonded courier service transported the physical evidence directly across Washington state, initiating a rigorous battery of microscopic and chemical testing. Back in Spokane, the psychological pressure was immense, as the emergency court conservatorship hearing was scheduled to take place in less than 48 short hours. My parents' aggressive legal team continued to press relentlessly, filing urgent motions that demanded the court accept the addendum as absolute proof of financial consent. They foolishly believed their strategic maneuver had backed us into a hopeless corner, confident that a local judge would have no valid reason to doubt a signed contract. Sitting quietly in Maxwell's office, watching the heavy rain trickle down the window panes, I felt the heavy burden of time weighing heavily upon my anxious shoulders. Arthur remained a steadfast pillar of quiet strength, gently reminding me that truth never falters under pressure, no matter how desperately complex lies attempt to prevail over true justice. We knew that the forthcoming scientific results from the Seattle laboratory would either completely shatter my parents' deception or leave us deeply vulnerable to their malicious legal petition. As the clock relentlessly ticked down toward Friday afternoon, every passing minute felt like an agonizing eternity, keeping us suspended in breathless, tense anticipation for the ultimate truth arriving today. On Friday afternoon, the forensic laboratory delivered its formal technical report, providing the definitive scientific breakdown that completely dismantled my mother's elaborate deception. Utilizing advanced infrared spectrometry and high magnification microscopic analysis, the certified forensic examiner outlined 3 undeniable, scientifically proven facts for the court. First, the signature on the addendum was a perfect, microscopic geometric match to Arthur's authentic signature on page 2 of the original loan agreement. The examiner noted under sworn oath that human beings never sign their names in the exact same mathematical alignment twice, proving the signature was mechanically traced using a light board. Second, chemical spectrometry revealed that the ink toner on the addendum was a modern digital printer formulation that did not even exist when the initial contract was drafted many years ago. Finally, paper fiber analysis provided the most damning evidence of all. The structural fibers of the final page showed 0 signs of natural environmental aging whatsoever. The examiner concluded with absolute scientific certainty that the addendum was printed, traced, and attached within the last 14 days, coinciding precisely with Arthur's critical hospital stay. Eleanor had committed a severe felony to cover up her financial theft, manufacturing a fraudulent document while my grandfather was fighting for his life in intensive care. This conclusive technical report transformed her calculated defense into undeniable evidence of criminal forgery, exposing her entire scheme to the unsparing light of forensic science. Armed with this unassailable technical breakdown, we held the definitive proof required to completely destroy my parents' case and hold them fully accountable in county court today. Maxwell Sterling carefully aligned the printed pages of the forensic report, placed them inside a heavy leather binder, and secured it with a heavy stainless steel clip. He locked the confidential file into his steel filing cabinet, turned around to face us, and offered a calm, confident smile that signaled complete, decisive victory. There was no remaining doubt or uncertainty. My mother's desperate attempt to fabricate a legal addendum had inadvertently handed us the ultimate weapon to destroy her entire case. Instead of protecting her stolen fortune, her reckless forgery provided undeniable evidence of severe criminal fraud, perjury, and malicious bad faith before a sitting judge. Sitting beside my grandfather, I looked at his weathered face and felt an overwhelming wave of relief and profound admiration wash over my grateful heart. He had weathered the painful shock of family abandonment, faced down a ruthless legal attack, and maintained his dignity through every trial without ever surrendering his spirit. We knew that when we stepped through the double doors of the Spokane County Courthouse on Monday morning, we were not merely defending his personal autonomy. We were standing up for every vulnerable elder who had ever been exploited by greedy relatives hiding behind hollow smiles and false filial affection. Truth, reinforced by unassailable scientific evidence and unyielding love, was about to completely dismantle my father's empire of deception once and for all. As we walked out of Maxwell's office into the cool evening air, Arthur took a deep, peaceful breath, completely ready to face the courtroom and reclaim his independent life today. There is a quiet, sacred dignity in the early hours before the world fully wakes, a fragile space where the leftover echoes of yesterday finally lose their power to sting. For so long, the weight of old burdens felt like a permanent architecture built within the chest, a fortress constructed from unsaid words, missed turns, and the cold, persistent fear that broken things remain forever shattered. Yet, standing here, with the soft indigo of morning slowly giving way to amber light, a subtle realization begins to take root in the soil of the mind. Survival was never about escaping the storm unscathed. It was always about learning how to breathe while the winds raged outside. The scars that once felt like emblems of defeat reveal themselves now as quiet maps of endurance, tracing every valley crossed and every dark night endured. To look back without flinching is not an act of defiance, but a gesture of gentle reconciliation with the past. The lingering ache is no longer a trap, but a doorway, a silent reminder that the heart survived the weight of its own heavy winters. In this still atmosphere, the air smells of wet earth and crisp pine, carrying a subtle promise that peace does not require the erasure of history, only the willingness to let it rest. Every quiet breath becomes a small declaration of presence, a soft surrender to the simple, profound truth that you are still here, standing upright, ready to meet the emerging dawn with unshielded eyes and an open heart. To unburden oneself is rarely a dramatic spectacle. More often, it unfolds in the quietest, most unheralded moments of an ordinary day. It is found in the sudden decision to unclamp tight shoulders, to let out a breath that has been held captive since childhood, and to stop demanding perfection from a human heart that was only ever meant to feel. For years, the mind mistook exhaustion for nobility, believing that carrying the world's sorrows was the only way to earn a right to belong. But grace operates under a gentler arithmetic. It gathers in the damp grass beneath bare feet, in the rhythmic kettle humming on the stove, and in the gold dust of sunlight filtering through worn curtains onto a wooden table. When you finally grant yourself permission to drop the heavy mantle of expectations, the universe does not collapse. Instead, it expands to welcome your authentic, unvarnished self. You begin to notice the wild clover pushing through cracked pavement, surviving not by sheer force, but through a quiet, stubborn insistence on existing. Healing asks us to adopt that same gentle persistence, to honor our fragile edges without condemning them. As the morning light stretches across the floor, painting warm geometric shapes against the wall, a deep and settling stillness replaces the old frantic noise. You realize that you do not need to fix every fractured piece to be worthy of peace. You only need to invite yourself back into the present moment, where life is quietly waiting to be lived, loved, and softly embraced. True healing is not the total eradication of dark memories, but the profound expanding of the heart until it is large enough to contain both sorrow and joy without breaking. There is a sacred threshold in every human journey where grief stops being an enemy and becomes instead an unexpected teacher, softening the hard contours of the soul and deepening our capacity for compassion. You look down at your own hands that have clung tightly to loss, hands that have trembled in uncertainty, and you realize they are also capable of holding light, warmth, and brand new beginnings. The darkness was never a sign that you were lost. It was merely the soil in which your deepest roots were quietly growing toward something stronger. As the sun rises higher into the vast sky, casting away the remaining shadows, an undeniable clarity washes over you. The pain of yesterday was real, but it does not get the final word on who you are or who you are becoming. Life does not demand that you forget where you have been, only that you refuse to build a home inside your former wounds. By forgiving yourself for the times you stumbled in the dark, you open an inner reservoir of resilience that no external hardship can ever drain. Hope returns not as a grand, roaring thunderclap, but as a steady, quiet warmth spreading beneath the ribs, a certainty that light always finds a way through the smallest crevices, transforming even the heaviest grief into radiant, enduring grace. Stepping back into the rhythm of the living world requires a courage that is gentle, slow, and deeply rooted in the earth. It begins with small, deliberate choices, listening intently to the wind rustling through summer leaves, sharing a warm drink with a friend without hiding behind guarded answers, and allowing your laughter to ring out unfiltered for the first time in years. Rebuilding a life after prolonged sorrow is like tending a neglected garden after a long, frozen winter. You turn the dark soil with patience, clear away the withered weeds of old doubts, and plant fresh seeds without needing to see the full bloom right away. Each day offers a fresh canvas upon which you can paint new habits, sweeter thoughts, and tender connections with the people who cross your path. You discover that vulnerability is not a liability, but the very bridge that connects your spirit to the shared heartbeat of humanity. When you allow others to see your truth, your unpolished, genuine humanity, you grant them the silent permission to do the exact same. The world suddenly appears far less lonely, filled instead with kindred souls who are all navigating their own quiet passages toward healing. With every step you take along the gravel path today, your feet feel firmer, lighter, and more attuned to the steady melody of existence. You are no longer merely surviving the passing hours. You are actively engaging with the rich, vibrant tapestry of life again. Looking out toward the horizon, where the sky merges seamlessly with the endless earth, a deep sense of belonging settles over your spirit like a warm, comforting blanket. You understand now that your story was never a tragedy defined by its darkest chapters, but a triumphant testament to the enduring beauty of human renewal. The journey has transformed you, not into someone immune to pain, but into someone who knows how to transmute suffering into wisdom, kindness, and unwavering hope. You stand as a living beacon for anyone still wandering through their own dark nights, a quiet proof that the light always returns, that spring always breaks through the frozen ground, and that healing is a birthright waiting to be claimed. Moving forward, you carry no lingering bitterness, only an immense gratitude for the breath in your lungs, the warmth on your skin, and the infinite possibilities stretching out before you. The future is no longer an intimidating blank void, but an open expanse of grace, inviting you to create, to dream, and to love, with a freedom you have never known before. As you take a deep, grounding breath and step confidently into the golden light of the new day, you realize that you were never broken beyond repair. You were simply being forged into something braver, softer, and infinitely more beautiful. A soul fully awakened to the wonder of being alive, ready to walk forward and light the way for others. In the wake of the catastrophic courtroom defeat, the unyielding wheels of the criminal justice system turned rapidly to hold my father and mother fully accountable for their actions. Confronted with unassailable forensic evidence of forged court documents, perjury, and felony financial elder abuse, the Spokane County District Attorney swiftly filed formal criminal charges against Richard and Eleanor. Facing the grim prospect of lengthy state prison sentences, their expensive legal defense team folded completely, forcing them into a humiliating plea agreement that demanded total restitution to Arthur. To satisfy the staggering court-ordered financial judgments and pay off soaring legal fees, a devastating asset forfeiture process swept through their once glamorous lives like a destructive winter storm. Before a crowd of curious onlookers, a heavy tow truck arrived at Brandon's apartment complex to repossess his brand new luxury SUV right out of his assigned parking space. My father was legally forced to liquidate his entire private collection of rare vintage wines at a massive financial loss through a high-profile international auction house. Meanwhile, Eleanor stood quietly in line at local pawn shops, tearfully surrendering her expensive designer handbags and diamond jewelry to cover crippling court penalties and avoid immediate incarceration behind bars. Stripped of their unearned wealth, buried under mounting debts, and facing public disgrace across Spokane, their hollow empire, built on superficial status, crumbled into absolute ruin. Watching their self-inflicted downfall brought us no vengeful joy, but rather a quiet, sobering sense of cosmic closure, proving that lives rooted in deceit inevitably shatter under their own heavy weight today. The ultimate financial reckoning extended directly to the sprawling 6-bedroom suburban mansion my parents had arrogantly occupied rent-free for over a decade. Unbeknownst to Richard, Arthur had quietly transferred the property deed years ago into an irrevocable living trust, designating me as sole trustee and ultimate beneficiary upon his eventual passing. With my father and mother facing severe criminal sentencing and possessing no legal right to reside on the estate, I exercised my trustee authority to issue an immediate, non-negotiable emergency eviction notice. 30 days later, under the watchful, stern gaze of a Spokane County Sheriff's deputy, the final chapter of their lavish, unearned lifestyle played out quietly on the concrete driveway. Brandon was forced to personally pack his belongings into crumpled cardboard boxes and load them into a cheap, rented moving van. His former arrogance completely shattered into quiet, painful humiliation. My father repeatedly called Arthur's cell phone from a blocked number, desperately begging for a temporary extension or a financial gesture of mercy. But my grandfather held his phone in calm, silent resolution. Arthur permanently blocked the number, steadfastly refusing to allow emotional blackmail to compromise the sacred sanctuary of peace we had fought so fiercely to rebuild and protect from harm. As the moving truck pulled away from the quiet suburban cul-de-sac, the grand estate was officially reclaimed and restored to its rightful, honorable purpose. Standing beside my grandfather on the freshly swept porch, we watched the last remnants of entitlement drive away into the afternoon sun, leaving behind a profound, unshakable atmosphere of complete liberation today. With the criminal court proceedings concluded and our family estate fully secured, Arthur sat down at Maxwell Sterling's heavy mahogany desk to execute his final, irrevocable act of stewardship. With swift, unwavering strokes of his fountain pen, my grandfather signed a brand new last will and testament that permanently erased Richard, Eleanor, and Brandon from his personal legal legacy. He did not leave them a single dollar out of misplaced parental obligation, ensuring they were legally disinherited and stripped forever of any future claims to his hard-earned life wealth. Instead, Arthur designated a generous bequest to ensure my complete financial security, while allocating the vast majority of his multi-million-dollar fortune to establish a permanent charitable endowment foundation. We formally chartered the Arthur Vance Elder Rights Protection Foundation, an endowed nonprofit organization dedicated to safeguarding vulnerable senior citizens across Washington state from financial exploitation. The foundation's core mission was specifically designed to fund free legal aid, specialized forensic accounting audits, and emergency housing for elderly individuals facing predatory abuse from greedy, manipulative family members. Sitting in Maxwell's sunlit conference room, listening to Arthur articulate his inspiring vision for the foundation, I felt my heart swell with overwhelming pride, immense gratitude, and deep emotional healing. What had begun as a devastating betrayal in a cold hospital room had blossomed into an enduring beacon of hope, protection, and true justice for countless vulnerable elders across our state. Through this foundation, Arthur transformed his painful trial into an eternal legacy of compassion, ensuring that his life's work would serve humanity for generations to come. Today, a few days after signing the new estate documents, Arthur called me into his private study on a quiet, sunlit afternoon. He opened a small velvet jewelry box resting on his mahogany desk, revealing an exquisite vintage platinum ring featuring an emerald-cut diamond that caught the warm sunlight. This was my grandmother's cherished wedding ring, a priceless family heirloom that Eleanor had greedily demanded for years, but Arthur had steadfastly refused to surrender to her. Taking my hand between his calloused fingers, my grandfather gently slid the ring onto my finger, his blue eyes brimming with quiet tears of affection and gratitude. Your grandmother always believed that true beauty belongs to those who possess a pure heart, Chloe, he whispered softly, his voice trembling with deep emotion. You stood by me when everyone else turned away, and you carried my soul through the darkest winter of my life. Looking down at the sparkling diamond, I felt a profound wave of warmth and generational continuity wash over my spirit, honoring the memory of the woman who came before me. Over the following weeks, Arthur and I spent our afternoons thoroughly cleaning and rearranging every corner of our home, throwing open heavy windows to let fresh mountain air sweep through the rooms. We scrubbed away every physical and emotional trace of past conflict, replacing the lingering scent of anxiety with fresh pine, blooming jasmine, and quiet contentment. Together, we restored our living space into a sacred haven of peace, purity, and light, where past betrayals could no longer cast a shadow today. From the open French doors of the sunlit living room, the soft, crystalline notes of a piano began to drift gently across the porch, carried by the warm spring breeze. A talented neighborhood piano student, whom we proudly sponsored, was practicing her scales, filling the air with a bright, uplifting melody that spoke of renewal and hope. Arthur closed his eyes, leaning back comfortably in his rocking chair as the music washed over him, a serene, untroubled smile softening the weathered lines of his peaceful face I sat on the wide wooden steps beside him, resting my head gently against his shoulder, feeling an overwhelming stillness settle deep into the sanctuary of my heart. Looking out over the vibrant green lawn and the blooming dogwood trees lining our fence, I reflected upon the miraculous, heart-wrenching journey that had brought us to this moment. I realized with profound clarity that while blood ties had once bound us to people driven by greed, true belonging had been given to us by those who chose unconditional love. The broken family had been healed. The dark shadows of betrayal had been permanently swept away, and our days were now filled with peace, music, and abiding grace. Family, I understood deeply, is not merely a random coincidence of shared bloodlines or biology, but a conscious, sacred choice of kindness, cultivated through life's fiercest storms. Sitting together in the warm afternoon light, listening to the piano music soar into the clear blue sky, our hearts rested in the eternal promise of spring, whole and forever free.